brief, and we will introduce it visually shortly. So this panel is entitled, "What are the public policy issues that must be addressed to make next generation video media feasible?" Throughout the day we've heard lots of actual comments about how regulation might actually make cloud TV better, worse, possible. The words net neutrality have come up a number of times, various sorts of regulation, copyright. There's a whole slew of regulatory, government policy sorts of questions that certainly can affect the trajectory of a cloud TV, how quickly, how big, what it may cost, and all those things are interconnected. I believe that investors sort of care how the government policy looks, and will invest or not invest more or less based on the policy framework. So this is the most important panel of the day, because if we don't get the policy right, all of these great ideas just won't count anymore. And that comes up, obviously, from someone whose life has been tied up in policy. That's all I know. So obviously, it's the most important thing. So on that note, I'd like to begin our, you all have the bios in your package. So our first speaker is Susan Crawford from Benjamin Cardozo School of Law. And I think she often talks about things like net neutrality and such things. So we may
Yes. All right, so I know all your hearts quicken when you hear the words "the next panel." Hi, Pepper. How you doing? And I think the thing our field suffers from occasionally is a poverty of imagination. So it's my job to be a little sparky today. Speaking of sparky, my grandmother called the electricity bill the light bill, because from her perspective, that's all initially they could imagine electricity being used for. So just let that sink in for a little while, okay? Thank you. So let's not fall into an is-ism. This really isn't about Netflix. This is about presence, human presence, made possible by very high-capacity networks. Because we're moving inevitably to fiber, immune to electrical interference, unlimited capacity, OpEx far lower than copper over time, 15 to 30% lower. Fiber policy is wireless policy, so the idea that the world is going mobile is absolutely in sync with this. As Pepper said, we're going to need fiber deep into towers. We're also going to need it into people's homes. And symmetrical. It is true that the cable plant is going to provide lots of download speeds, but upload, different story, unless they swap out every single piece of electronics in the system. So because we're a world of speakers and people who want to be present to each other, not just consumers, it's going to be important and, in fact, inevitable that we move to fiber. It's inevitable because of all the things we all know about. We move to larger screens. If every surface in this room is a screen, it's going to need fiber, cloud on-demand interactivity, simultaneity. It's just obvious that all this is coming. Now, there are misaligned incentives and real problems of timing in lots of countries. Lots of money sloshing around, but not necessarily being assigned to investment, the patient investment that's needed to upgrade to fiber to the home. Capital expenditures for our major high-speed internet access providers in the United States are really low as a percentage of revenue, somewhere between 12 and 15% of revenue. In 2012, AT&T returned more money to its shareholders in the form of buybacks and dividends than it invested in its network. Okay, so just think about that. We're not making an enormous investment that we would need, and it would take 90 years for this transition to happen if we just wait for the forces that need to work themselves out. So absent competitive threats or oversight, no real change ahead. What's the problem? People just sweat the copper. It makes sense. It's not evil. It's just what you do is a profit maximizing business. Use your cash flows for dividends and buybacks. Focus on mobile wireless where the returns are greater. AT&T and Verizon have mostly gone in this direction. Lots of healthy returns still there in copper. In the United States, we're facing a dramatic problem of cable monopolies for high-speed internet access. The speaker, the venture capitalist, mentioned this, and it's absolutely apparent that cable distributors will account for 85% of high capacity but asymmetrical connections in America. So that's a problem if we're thinking of moving to symmetrical fiber. No incentive to go that direction. deep variance by region for fiber, much more of it. This is all obvious to you in South Korea, Japan, and US, seeing something like 19% of total households, low in Europe, and in the MENA countries, lower still. Cost directly tied to adoption. We've seen some dramatic stuff happening in the United States recently. Chattanooga, I've never seen a prouder mayor than the Chattanooga mayor, who I met with about a week ago. This is his top topic, to talk about fiber to the home in Chattanooga for $70 a person. He thinks it's the most important thing that's happened in Chattanooga. And he's determined to help other mayors do the same thing in the United States. A lot easier if you've got electric utility that you can boss around. Kansas City, another example of this. I think of this as the World's Fair for fiber. We needed World's Fairs for electricity to show everybody what was possible. All the different devices that could be used in the home and in business using electricity. We haven't had that yet for very high capacity, low latency networks. And these spots of light, literally in the United States for us, are going to demonstrate what's possible. So there are lots of models, ways of going to do this. If the private sector owns and run it, we'll see little change. That's what's happened in the US so far. Singapore taking a very direct route, giving direct funding to an operator who's then forced to act as a wholesale provider. Stockholm with this blended public-private funded manager providing wholesale open access services. Australia, now a question mark after their recent election. And I'm looking forward to Minister Conroy's discussion of this, where the public sector would own, but the private sector would run the national broadband network there, a fiber to the home network for 93% of Australians. I just want to drive home this electrification analogy because it really speaks to me. Private profit maximizing firms will cooperate, choose markets. It took a long time for electrification to roll out across America. From the 1880s until the 1930s, electricity is present in American life, but only for very large cities and only for the richest people there, not made available to farmers until there was real political pressure brought to bear. When FDR came into office in 1935, 90% of farmers in America did not have electricity. This is what happens with this kind of utility, basic business, basic input into everybody's life, and that's what fiber access should be. Where consolidation is possible, competition is impossible. We certainly saw that with electrification, with all the private utilities snapping each other up, very highly concentrated market. In 1907, this dramatic move, Con Ed, a private utility, without oversight, acquires control of 98% of electricity in New York City, and it takes real political will to make sure that people aren't gouged and that service is kept up, although, footnote, Metro North, worried about that. Municipal systems over time, so the birch rod in the closet, the idea that if the public entity could be present in this market, it constrains the avarice, or whatever you want to call it, of the private actor. And we saw a big uptick in municipal electric systems in the United States, which then dipped but leveled off and remains at about 2,000 municipal electric utilities here, which are, and many of them are getting into the fiber optic business. It genuinely helped the rollout of electricity in the United States. 3,300 of them in the mid-1920s. FDR's arrival, though, leadership makes a big difference too. And his trips to Virginia, where he saw in Warm Springs just how bad life was without electricity, made him think very strongly about the need for public leadership. And he took on the special interests in the electrical world. Lots of legislation, Rural Electrification Act, and again, this idea of the birch rod in the closet. Not public entities don't have to supply all of it, but they have to be present as a check on the market and a test of the pricing. So, just to run through some quick policy issues for you in the United States, we're facing upwards of 19 states that make it impossible or difficult for cities to do this for themselves. Federal tax laws, especially in the bonding area, that make it difficult for public-private partnerships to emerge. Laws in promoting single-use networks. The President's announcement of the E-rate program recently is about the most exciting thing in fiber policy that we're seeing in the United States. He's saying 99% of schools and libraries in the United States will have fiber. He's hoping for gigabit access. The risk is that everybody will lobby to get the entire USF program capped and not allow any new money into this program. That would be a real problem. As it is, he's saying it's going to be $5 a year for each American, which doesn't sound like very much money to me, to get our kids on the best possible network. Lots of problems with multiple dwelling units and landlords. Just recently, the New York Times ran an article about special contracts and payments made to supers. I love my super, and I hope he hasn't signed one of these in New York City, saying you'll get a kickback, in essence. You'll get free cable if you let us come in and market our services. Problems about that all over the United States. Predatory pricing, pole attachments. We could go on about pole attachment policy in the United States. It's a real problem, and the FCC is going to need to take this on in this next bout. Interconnection, just in the last panel was mentioned that you can do things to latency for Netflix. Well, yes, you can, and you can also do things at the gateways between your network and somebody else's network, if you're powerful enough, that will make life miserable for packets trying to get there from a network that has not paid tribute to you. And that's a real policy problem, and one that the FCC is going to have to take on. Usage caps, very briefly mentioned last time, especially where the distributor is in the content market as well as in the distribution of high-speed internet access market. Usage caps can be a killer for the advent of very high-capacity services that will feel expensive if those people already love sports. Sports is an interesting vector here. Landlord problems I mentioned. And you knew I was going to talk about this. The overall deregulation of high-speed internet access services is a tremendous problem. The idea that Pepper can say that there's some magical difference between managed IP services and internet IP is just a creature, an outgrowth of an unmanaged situation from the regulatory point of view, where the owner of a pipe that has lots of capacity can just dynamically decide where to allocate that capacity and how to make sure that its stuff is treated better than somebody else's stuff. And that's because we've had a vacuum of policy in this country for the last 10 years. So that's a big one. Suggestions for cities, it would be good, and Chicago's going this direction, Seattle, we have some real, very brave mayors in the United States who are pushing this way. Make sure you have wholesale fiber rings, using your power over city-owned rights-of-way to drive and price regulate a wholesale fiber network. That's what happened in Seoul. Require non-discrimination, interconnection, and build-out. Require, in order to avoid this risk of everybody protecting their retirement plans by sweating the copper, find a way to lower the wholesale price of fiber and make that transparent pricing so that your retail providers show up and provide lots and lots of competition. In Seoul, there are 3 or 4 fiber-to-the-home competitors for everybody, and prices are very low. And that would be good for cities, and eliminate power of landlords to create these crazy de facto exclusive relationships, even though they're illegal under federal law. So what should nations do? Here I get to be very optimistic. Aggressively carry out universal service levies to fund this transition in less dense areas, because this is a utility, it is by nature a natural monopoly. We have to cross-subsidize areas where the private market won't go, include the cable system operators in this, set a baseline and let all policy flow from that. Maybe it's 100 megabits symmetrical for now. I think that's not going to be enough for what's coming up, but at least it's a place to start. Establish local public infrastructure funding banks with this patient capital. It does pay off, just not like a media company. Encourage cities to do what they can and work on all this. It's really a question of money. This is all about investment and making sure that the bond structure frameworks are there legally and locally is going to make a big difference. This is just like electrical service. Like electrical service, it's going to take a while to get here, and it should be affordable and standard and it is part of every element of a flourishing human life. So that's my breezy jog through what's happening on the policy front. There is a lot to work through. But I'm optimistic that with people like Mr. Conroy and otherwise around us, we will get there. Thank you very much.
And so our next speaker, in fact, is the aforementioned Senator Stephen Conroy from Australia. I think fair to say the father of the National Broadband Network in Australia. And we'll see what's happening there.
Well, thank you. This is the first time I've ever followed Susan on a panel. It will never happen again because after she's finished, there really is not much point in me saying anything. You can see why she's one of my heroes. It's great to be back at the State of Telecom. As has been mentioned, I'm now the former Minister. Last year I had the honour of being the Minister. We've had an election since then, just recently, last few weeks, and the government was overturned, and a new government with a different policy agenda is walking its way through trying to unpick much of the policy agenda that we had put in place. But as I did mention last year colourfully, Australia is very lucky that we have a federal constitution where we have express federal responsibility for postal, telegraphic, telephonic and other like services. Thank God somebody in 1901 put the phrase like services into our constitution. They were included because of the international dimension of these services, more so than the need for national coordination. As an island, a long way away from everywhere else, international connectivity, even in the form of postal services back then, was vital for Australians. The power has been interpreted as including the regulation of radio and telecommunication broadcasting. The power has been used but not tested to include the regulation of internet services and internet content. While the legislative scheme to implement the power places emphasis on industry self-regulation, there are two regulators. The Australian Communications and Media Authority regulates technical aspects and customer and content standards, and the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission is an economy-wide regulator that has specific powers over telecommunications access arrangements. So the Australian market structure, as some of you remember from my discussion last year, is unique, and I always have to stress this. Our policy was driven by a unique set of circumstances of the structure of our market in Australia. Our original incumbent telco, Telstra, retains the copper access network at this moment, and a national mobile network with more than 50% market share. It also owns one of our two HFC networks that almost completely duplicate their coverage with its rival, and a 50% stake with News Corporation in the only provider of pay TV content called Foxtel. In mobile, there are three network operators, each with full national coverage, though Telstra has close to 50% of the market share. So our industry structure has been rectified by the decision of the previous government, and even the current government believe in the fundamental decision to structurally separate the wholesale and the retail markets. So both governments, even though one wants to use fibre and one is going to actually, believe it or not, buy a copper network off Telstra or attempt to take a copper network off Telstra through negotiation of various ways. I don't know of anybody in the world who would want to take on a copper network, but welcome to the new Australian government's position. As part of the rollout planned by the previous government, Telstra was to decommission the copper network, as well as cease using HFC for data. Still use it for pay TV, but decommission it for data. As I mentioned, our second HFC network was run by Optus, which is now Singtel. It was also going to decommission, in fact it was going to decommission its pay TV voluntarily network and move it all online onto the fibre network. And as I said, while the incoming government proposes to change the architecture from FTTH to FTTN, they've indicated they will continue, as I said, to pursue the structural separation argument. So my comments today are based on the assumption that the separation is continued. The final element of particular importance to Australia is both the proportion of content that comes from overseas and how to continue to support local production. So we have a unique set of circumstances which drives different policy proposals, that some of which would not be relevant here in the US. So in the Australian context, therefore, the key issues of cloud-based video are market structure, cost recovery, copyright classification and local production. So I wanted to talk in turn. We've seen some great discussions earlier today and it's been a great privilege. Ellie, thank you for the invitation again to sit through some of those presentations and go into some really in-depth thinking and discussion on them. I won't add to definitions of cloud that have been covered. The economic regulation challenge. The network model being built in Australia includes a multicast service to facilitate the bulk distribution of video content. However, this and the structural separation that are being achieved will not guarantee the outcome of separating content and carriage. It is still possible for what we now call retail service providers, or RSPs, to obtain exclusive rights to video content. Two different paths this can lead to have been seen in Australia in the past. The first is the situation that developed with mobile network operators acquiring content. So our three mobile network operators went out and bought, as an example, sporting content, different sports, because they wanted the exclusiveness of it. So each of the operators entered into its own exclusive content deals, but each had a relatively even market share. The key outcome is that only a proportion of the total audience got to see the content. So the content didn't become the basis for which people chose to pick that provider over that provider over that provider. So in Australia, if you had the cricket, well, one company had cricket, one had tennis, one had football, and if you wanted to watch all three, no one bought three packages. So it didn't become the delineator that people initially thought it might. But only with sport content is there still an interest in exclusive rights from mobile operators. Even though it hasn't built their market share, it hasn't ultimately, other content hasn't become a key differentiator either. It didn't really take off. So this was the same as the history of walled garden content on dial-up services pre the sort of the internet really taking off. The second is the case where we had two directly competing pay TV operators I mentioned earlier. Only one provider has a lead on subscribers, so the larger gets an ability to bid more for rights, and the content imbalance marginally assists subscriber acquisition. So the growing subscriber base makes the acquisition of more content possible, and so it goes on until the market eventually tips. And what we saw in Australia was effectively, even though I said we have two operators, we only really have one. The other one simply now went bankrupt and resells completely the same content that was on the winner. So if you bought an Optus package, you are basically getting a resold Foxtel, Telstra, News Limited content on your model. So both of these scenarios can occur with video from the cloud as much as video from a pay TV playout centre or exclusive content on mobiles. There is of course a decision here for content providers. Already, sporting bodies in Australia are starting to realise that the sale of exclusive rights restricts audiences, the number of people who can get to see it. Some, like Australia's Indigenous Football Code, are already moving to take full control and will put their own video into the cloud. They very much be following what the NFL and the NBA have been doing here, and they are launching in this direction. Their intent is to bypass platform providers, and they were huge fans, as you can imagine, of our proposal of fibre to the home. This made their job a hell of a lot easier. And they wanted to make the content directly available, irrespective of who provides the fan with their communications service. The policy question that arises from all of this in Australia is whether content owners will be able to come to the realisation and break out of their existing relationships, whether they can actually stop using the pay TV operator, set up their own channels. So think Chelsea TV, I'm a Chelsea fan, think Barcelona TV, think Liverpool, Man United TV, direct to consumers. If they can't, government action could be necessary. In general, the easiest way to assure the outcome is preemptive rules, banning the kinds of bundling and tying behaviour rather than the more traditional antitrust approach. And that's something that has been discussed in Australia. The question is which has the greatest cost of error? Not regulating when regulation is required or regulating when it wasn't required. And given that the second error is possibly more easily to rectify than the former, a bias to limiting bundling is justified in an Australian context, in my view. So there's been concern about the model of cloud-based video results in undercompensation of network operators. We've heard some of that today. Cloud-based video, by definition, is a pretty much over-the-top model in Australia because of the cost of getting content from the US, and indeed of transmission costs across our continent. Internet plans have mostly included download limits. We are one of the 4 countries in the world that already has download caps. This means that RSPs are able to be compensated by the costs they face in carrying video across their networks. And the second device available is traffic shaping. A number of RSPs or ISPs identify peer-to-peer traffic and deprioritise it so that at peak times it's very, very slow. The management of video content in vertical models ensured tight control of copyright. The archetypal cloud model is the peer-to-peer model, like BitTorrent, which bits of video are obtained from different computers, but are also the best example of copyright infringement. Australia, not proud to say, claims the record for the most unauthorised downloads of Game of Thrones, thank you, to some of the providers in the room. The reason is very simple. In a world of globalised discussion online, the water cooler discussions about video content are no longer local. Simultaneous global release of movies is now common, and we're increasingly seeing television programs in the same week as they're shown in the US. Even though our peak viewing times are very different to yours, they are rushing them onto our TV screens because they're getting killed by the downloads. In fact, Doctor Who, the new series, the very first one, our public broadcaster made a decision to put it online 1 week before they showed it. 1 week before they showed it live. 180,000 Australians viewed it. I confess I was one of them. So 180,000 Australians watched it legally online in the week before it actually went to air. So the evidence is showing that legitimate content sales, such as through iTunes, also a cloud service, reduce unauthorised downloads, but they're not showing that they wipe them out. Another one for us is geographic licensing. Still creates an issue. Got to mention earlier, there are movies and TV shows where the Australian rights are just never sold. Yet they have an audience, often small obviously. Australian law makes it illegal to circumvent geo-blocks. Illegal. Not to say it doesn't happen, but it's illegal under law. We already have legitimate doubts about the competition impact of these for things like software downloads. And if right holders expect these laws to be maintained for video content, they could expect potentially an explicit use it or lose it principle to be introduced. So if you don't actually ever show it in any of the other forms in Australia, then it is going to be able to be downloaded, no geo-blocking. An option is to remove the offence to circumventing geo-blocking if the content is not sold locally, for instance, within 6 months of the first global showing of it. Program classification. Australia has different laws to the US. The link between content and platform also facilitated program classification. In Australia, industry codes establish the content warning schemes used on free and pay TV. While these are also placed some time of day restrictions on certain content classes, their main purpose is to inform the audience about the nature of the program. But there is no equivalent scheme for cloud-based services and no effective way for a national classification scheme to operate. Some cloud-based providers do operate a degree of control. YouTube, as you'd all know, has content that can be used by registered viewers over the age of 18. But developing a global classification scheme might be a challenge. Cloud-based services have the ability to provide more information than can be covered in a coding system, in an EPG, or in a 30-second announcement. So I'm sure I'm probably over time by now, so I don't want to keep going. Thank you. It was mentioned earlier, one of the other ways that people deal with Telstra allow unmetered content in their download caps for their Foxtel product. Bear in mind I said they own 50% of Foxtel. So when you've got a download cap, the Foxtel doesn't count. If you are a rival producer downloading, it gets counted in your cap. This is the world that awaits you in some of your debates here in America. These are seriously anti-competitive pieces of behaviour, when you introduce download caps, that is one of the things I would say to you will very much become an issue for the FCC. I've run over time again. Thank you. I have a 7 o'clock plane, I apologise, Ellie, that I have to catch, so I might have to run out before we get to questions. So my apologies if I do, but thank you again very much.
Thank you. Okay, our next speaker is in Washington, D.C. And if the technology works, we will see him.
Well, you won't see him. He doesn't have his. Well, you'll see his slides.
That is Henning Schultering, who's Chief Technology Officer at the FCC, and also a professor at Columbia Engineering Center. One of these, hopefully, Henning will be back.
Good. Henning, can you hear me? Henning. Come on, Henning. Henning, can you hear me? Henning?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Okay.
Can you just make sure?
Okay, here we go.
Just get the. Hold on one
We'll be
second.
off momentarily. Would you tell him 10 minutes and then the gong and then 2 more minutes?
Now let's do this. 'Cause apparently this was
The FCC can solve that problem.
Henning, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Yep.
This is not working. This is connecting in. Wonderful.
Tell you what.
I know what I'll do. I got it.
Well, okay. What are you going to do?
Yes. Henning, go ahead and talk.
Thank you. I can hear you.
Can everybody hear him?
Get started.
Go ahead, Henning.
Okay.
10 minutes.
I'm sorry that I can't be there in person. Travel budget, sequestration, all that. So what I want to do, it turns out unintentionally, but to follow up a little bit on the presentation that was done earlier by Bob Pepper and some of the other raising of hands that was done before the break, namely to address a slightly longer term perspective. The Cisco presentation was addressing the 2017 timeframe. You can think of my presentation as kind of a longer what-if presentation, namely what happens if we were to assume that some time frame, whether that's 10 years out, as opposed to like a 2017 time horizon for Bob's presentation, or whether that's 20 years out, what would happen if we converge from a hybrid environment that we have today, where video is largely still linear and largely still digital circuits type of switch or digital distribution cable to an all IP environment, either infrastructure based or an over the top environment. So I'll talk about two issues that go along with that, namely what we might call the next phase of convergence, namely the complete changeover to an all IP network. Picking up a little bit on Sis Crawford's comment that this is more than just video entertainment, although I will travel into the same class on that. I talked a little bit about the impact on consumers and industry structure, and then some of the old goals and some of the challenges that we as probably somebody has already pointed out earlier today, is while we are all excited about the video or video on demand or IP or other types of services, if you look at video viewing by minute, it is largely still a linear world. Hours spent per day, you still have a vast majority of the minutes per day are still consumed by sitting in front of a TV of some sort. So there's plenty of room to grow if you want to look at it slightly differently.
Henning, I just want to give you a heads up. Our projector is kind of on its last legs, and the colors are a little washed out. So we are unable to read the white on white, unfortunately. So I can see it. I can see it on my screen that I'm looking at. But just so you know, the numbers under Q2 and Q2 2012 and 2013 we can't see.
Okay, let me then do the oral rendition here a little bit. So if you look at statistics, so we have on traditional TV, and roughly it hasn't really changed last year from about 146 minutes up slightly and 144 for traditional TV. And watching video on the internet, according to these statistics, and you get somewhat different ones, it has increased by about 30 seconds year over year, from about 5 minutes and 50 seconds to 6 minutes and 6 hours, right? It's all hours, 6 hours and 28 minutes. So about increased by half an hour monthly statistics. So a significant increase, but still, comparatively speaking, we're talking 5% of the total that we have in terms of linear viewing. I'm sure the version of that has been shown multiple times. It's clearly about half is real-time entertainment. But to just point out again the need to think beyond the extreme asymmetry that we see today, in the sense that our networks are now, unlike the old DSL days where you might have an asymmetry of maybe 3 to 1, like 1.5 to 4 megabits type of services. Now you sometimes have 20 to 1 asymmetry, 20 megabits down, 1 megabit up. I do believe that from a policy, funding, and general network perspective, it is not healthy if we want to support high-quality video services on the upload side, on the upstream side. I mentioned, for example, telemedicine, massive online open courses, then video conferencing, business video conferencing, as well as remote monitoring, multi-camera monitoring, etc., all of which require significant upstream bandwidth. So what happens if this all moves to IP? Let's look at kind of a hypothetical scenario. You took existing HD content, you have a Netflix recommendation that I just picked up. For 146 hours of month HD video, you have about 410 gigabytes a month in that. Which is obviously a lot. That's roughly 20 times for the that we currently have on broadband networks, via broadband networks, but 20 times over some decade or so isn't all that much. It's not an extraordinary growth rate either. But one additional variable that will want to large numbers, I'm concerned with those as well. If you look at 4K Ultra HD, kind of the next thing after 3D, I suppose, somewhat facetiously, then you're talking 45 to 60 gigabytes for each, let's say, 2-hour movie. So you're now, again, an order of magnitude or 2 above that, even if you can assume that H265 will drive that down by a factor up to a half, which is very optimistic. So if we look at the financials a little bit, today we have this weird kind of situation that is all conventional wisdom, I would say, everybody has it. Could wireless and satellite be a substitute for traditional wired broadband? People say, wow, the bandwidth cost. If you look at the actual usage at the moment, the costs aren't actually that far apart. You get for a typical, say, roughly $50 type a basic cable package for cable internet that you might get. So you have for 20 gigabyte median consumption that is common on one large provider. You end up with an effective bandwidth cost of $2.50 per gigabyte, which isn't ridiculously out of line with what you would end up on either a satellite connection, roughly at the highest end package, about $5 a gigabyte, for a 25 gigabyte package, so that's similar consumption, or the 4G type model where you end up with $5 to $15. Now, obviously, as soon as you go into those higher bitrate, higher consumption that video would necessitate as replacement, you're obviously way out of that same one, simply because it's on fixed high cost, relatively low incremental cost for them. The other one that I'd like to just briefly that has been mentioned, I think, in two cases already, is that we have now the ability to move content a lot closer to the end system. One comment I wanted to add to that is that one of the more interesting notions that I've seen, where there's lots of talk about software-defined networking, quite frankly, for many of the applications that I've seen, I don't see it as all that interesting. What I see as interesting is the ability to move storage and processing, video processing in particular, much closer to the end system as opposed to replacing the guts of core routers. So you can now conceive of moving storage to cell towers, Wi-Fi base stations, remote units with DSL, and anything that's relatively close to the user, so that the content volume you have to ship across all the features is much less. We really have two efficiencies that we get from that. And one is the most common one, I suspect has been mentioned several times already, namely one, you get the one download many retrieval model. That only works really when you have a relatively large user population for very popular content. The other one, which is also at least as interesting and is independent of that particular demographic issue, is the time shifting approach, namely that you can essentially stop your server during low usage nighttime period and then deliver it during the peak period. As I mentioned earlier in the presentation, that we have a much more peaky network, and by putting storage close to the end system, even if the reuse factor isn't that high, we can essentially do daytime, nighttime load balance. The primary driver of that is storage cost, and you can actually, if you draw the comparative figures, they have gone down much more significantly than networking costs, simply because digging and other factors just don't apply that haven't really gone down in cost. Pole attachments, all these other things, you're not really worried about those in the storage market. So you can now put network appliances at the edge of the network that have previously unimaginable storage capacity. This is the Netflix example. We have 100 terabytes of disk and 1 terabyte of flash. So at least 1,000 movies that you store. I want to talk a little bit about the network question, namely what kind of networks are still support that. And actually the news there, I think, is beyond just a gut feeling. So, man, it's pretty good. At least for the cable TV side and the fiber side. It's really all, when it comes down to it, it's all about spectrum. Not over-the-air spectrum, the kind of stuff that we worry about auctioning, but if you think about the shared capacity in each of these networks, that is the bottleneck that we have. You've got about 30 megahertz or so DSL, in cellular and cable, you've got several hundred megahertz, that's essentially infinite for fiber. But the cable TV bandwidth, theoretically, on that shared segment, could go down for about 4.8 gigahertz. We could briefly go through the shared components of really what drives the limits of the network. One interesting perspective that I'd like to spend a minute or so on, namely, is that the differences between over-the-top video delivery and a delivery by an MVPD, essentially, once you look at this, and I've intentionally made the figures look somewhat similar, starts to look vanishingly small. It really is more about who owns what pieces as to where, as opposed to the transmission technology, the hardware, even the internet packets. They look essentially the same. The only real difference is possibly service flows at the cable DOCSIS layer and whose inventory tag is on the box. That, however, raises issues in terms of what we do when we have a large-scale abandonment of possibly the MVPD model. One of the interesting facets is that new entrants, such as Google, are not really claiming to be anything related to classical classifications on both the telecom side and the video side. What you do with emergency alerting, what you do with local context, what you do with local speed stations, what happens to local franchise authority, all of which are tied to classical video content. We also have the problem of fitting these new environments into the open internet policy buckets, not even just the classical title buckets, which are kind of floating over that. So for those interested, the Open Internet Advisory Committee had an interesting summary on the specialized services classification and some of the conceptual difficulties that arise as these services look essentially indistinguishable between a provided service and a low-cost service, at least from a technology perspective. Bandwidth-based switching was mentioned. What the competitive effect, consumer fusion effect is something that we are starting to see a fair amount of. While one can have all kinds of discussions about the economic efficiencies of market differentiation between licensed users, all other economic efficiency arguments, we see a lot of, on the wireless side, and to some extent the wired side, is people don't understand gigabytes. With adaptive video codecs, the same video can take vastly different amounts of gigabytes depending on where you watch and when you watch it. It's often difficult for users to determine what caused the sudden spike in bandwidth usage, and one can imagine all kinds of family drama in shared households to determine as to how many gigabytes the teenager has been using and what for and all of that. So I suspect the cost of economic efficiency don't quite take into account the transaction cost at the family level, shall we say. How do we future
Henning, I'm going to ask you to get your conclusion. 30 more seconds, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
So the big challenge was mentioned to future-proof networks as I have mentioned. My conclusion, all IP, HD video won't break the internet, but it makes way for classical regulatory categories and obligations that go along with that, and it raises a number of public policy issues in the competition, consumer confusion space, and how do we ensure universal access, scalable, and future-proof bandwidth.
Thank you, Adam. And if you could just hang on the line for a little bit while we have our last two speakers, and then we'll open up to questions. Thanks, Henning.
Thank you, Henning. Miss you up here in New York. Our next speaker, Lynn Calley. Lynn's the Senior VP of AT&T for Global Public Policy.
No slides for me.
You had slides.
All right.
I'm losing my mind today. It's one of those days.
That's all right.
There you go. Can you put that on for me? And I'll take my toys with me.
Good, okay. So let's just go this way.
Yes, face down. Thank you so much.
All right, can everyone hear me? Thank you. Thanks, Bob. Thanks, Ellie. Glad to be here. I think I'm actually going to start with a quote that was on one of Gary's slides. I don't think he said it, but it flipped by. And tell me if I got it right. Beware of fear is not grounded in data.
Yes.
And I thought that was useful because I think a lot of the allegations we hear about broadband today has really got this monster under the bed feel to it, and it's not grounded in the data. So I'd like to talk a bit about that. We'll get there. But some of it is competition is impossible, or if you leave things with the private sector, little is going to change. This just flies in the face of the facts. And I think we've got to talk about it. Right now, our video business and our broadband business is a $12 billion business growing at nearly 30%. This does not connote a cable monopoly. I'm from the telco company. We're also building a fiber network in Austin. So is Google. These are competitive services. It's also not a utility. You have multiple competitors providing differentiated services that are rapidly innovating. And we're also not Korea, where the number of people per square mile is 1,200 and not 88. We're also not going to see the government subsidy levels here that you see in Korea. But thankfully, we don't need to be Korea. And that's why I want to get into some of the facts. We're investing, AT&T is investing billions of dollars a year building out, further enhancing our all-IP broadband, wireline, and wireless networks. Just earlier this week, my chairman and CEO was in New York, and he said, apropos to today's conference, it's all about architecting, designing networks to deliver video. The future for us, whether it's fixed line or wireline, is about building a video delivery capability. And as has happened since the birth of the internet, the network is going to need to expand. We're going to need to invest a lot more money in new capabilities. I think Ivy got it right. You said it was $1 trillion since the year 2000, roughly. Actually, my number's about $1.2 trillion. $1.2 trillion in private investment in the networks in the United States. And for me, the primary public policy question, since most of the investment going forward is going to be private sector investment in this country, is whether we'll have an environment that drives investment or an environment that results in underinvestment and underperformance as we see in Europe. Here in the US, we've actually done well. We've seen well over $1 trillion in investment. Just last week, the Progressive Policy Institute released its latest report on US capital expenditures. The report found that AT&T once again leads the list of investment heroes for 2012. But not only that, 6 of the top 25 investors were telecom or cable companies that spent a total of $50.5 billion just last year in their networks. Now, you don't have to trust me. You don't have to trust the Progressive Policy Institute. The White House has done a study of the state of broadband in the United States. OSTP and the National Economic Council put out that study. It's from June. It is recent, and it is credible. And I'm going to spend some time looking at what that study had to say, that report. The report noted that just 2 of the largest U.S. telecom companies account for greater combined stateside investment than the top 5 oil gas companies and nearly 4 times more than the big 3 auto companies. The report also found that annual investment in U.S. wireless networks between 2009 and 2012 grew more than 40%. Investment in Europe during that time in their wireless networks was flat, and in Asia, it rose only 4%, and that included China. So facts have to matter in this policy debate. And these are important facts. And there are other facts, like what did we get for this build-out? And there have been a lot of allegations about the state of the networks in the United States. So again, I want to go back to this White House report so you can understand what the White House said. By nearly any metric, and I'm quoting, the last 4 years have been a period of tremendous growth in broadband infrastructure access in the digital economy upon which we rely. The average connection speed in the United States in the 4th quarter of 2012, this is from the report, was the 8th fastest among all nations, and from the report, and the fastest, that is a quote, the fastest when compared to other countries with either a similar population or landmass. The report also found that North America's average mobile data connection speed was the fastest in the world, nearly twice that available in Europe, and 5 times the global average. And as Ivy's notes showed, these networks, the White House found, were widely deployed. More than 10 megabits per second now reach 94% of American homes. Almost 81% of Americans have access to advanced mobile broadband. And there are 500 million connected devices in American homes and offices. This is not a sign of underinvestment or failure. And I recite all this again to say that facts matter. We have a largely light touch policy framework for wireless and broadband in this country. And this country has a nation with ubiquitous competing cable, telco, and wireless and satellite platforms. And that light touch regulatory platform has worked. It's driven investment. Does it mean we're done? Not a chance. We're not done. We need to do lots more investment to support the services we have here today, we've discussed here today. And the question is how best to continue. So just last year, AT&T announced a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar investment plan, as I mentioned, to continue to enhance and upgrade our wireline and wireless networks. Comcast demonstrated a 3 gigabit cable broadband network at the cable show. And Cable Labs has plans for more than 10 gigabit cable broadband capability. As I mentioned, Google's installing fiber And we're also installing fiber in Austin. And just this week, when we talk about the idea that this is a monopoly, or it's going to become a monopoly, just this week when my chairman was talking about our investments in broadband, he made the point for the next 20 years, at the Goldman confab, for the next 20 years, this is going to be a dogfight with cable as we each try to outdo and outinvest each other. That does not sound like a monopoly. That does not sound like underperformance or underinvestment. So this is all good, and I believe we need a light touch regulatory framework that leaves room for this type of competitive rivalry, innovation, and private investment. And a second and related concern is that we need to modernize our regulatory framework so we're driving the investment into next generation services and not old technology. And this goes to the PSTN question, right? And Ivy touched on it too, as carriers are moving more money towards next generation services. Look, it's not a question of if the PSTN is going to be shut down. It will sunset. The equipment has all the marks of manufacturer discontinued. About 75% of users have already cut the cord and they're exclusively satisfying their communication needs elsewhere. So there's plenty more to do, and it's important how we sunset the network. That's why AT&T's petitioned the FCC to allow and to monitor a trial of the transition to an all-IP network in at least a few wire centers. Our approach is to work deliberately to avoid any sort of flash cut. We want to work with federal, state, and local regulators and consumers in business to ensure that we identify and address issues raised. But we need to shift all our investment to these next generation networks. It doesn't make sense to keep supporting the PSTN. We need to ensure that this next generation technology is available to all Americans. So we want to get on with that. And as you sort of think through, all right, got applause from David, which is pretty good.
Serving all Americans is good for me.
That's good, and it's good with us too. And as you think through the policy questions, various people have raised some of the video policy questions. I'm not talking about just modernizing the telecom-specific rules. There are also video-specific rules that warrant modernization as well. You think of retransmission consent. It developed at a time when there was a single monopoly cable. At the time, there was a monopoly distribution platform. Those rules affect how the market operates. As video distribution has grown ever more competitive, I think it's time to revisit those rules. I think it was Tuna Moby this morning who talked about content being king. Well, it still is king, and I think you could see that in the prices for content. So certainly the content providers don't need a regulatory thumb on the scale when it comes to the retransmission consent rules. But finally, I want to mention one other thing as we talk about an environment supportive of investment, modernizing regulation so we're not putting investment in the wrong places. I also want to mention spectrum. Consumers are increasingly indifferent as to what device they're receiving their cloud-based services on or what platform it's being delivered over. We need more spectrum to do this simply, seamlessly, and reliably. From past, you certainly know AT&T's preference is exclusively licensed spectrum. The White House report also recognized this as optimal where feasible. But I also recognize there's huge value in unlicensed, there's huge value in increasing role for sharing spectrum going forward. The key is we need more spectrum, and this is going to be an all of the above strategy. So in the end, my message is the advent of cloud-based services is going to create challenges, it's going to create opportunities, and the reality is none of us in this room can really foresee how all those challenges will be met or how those opportunities will be seized. But we know it will cost money. It's going to require commercial flexibility, dynamism, and innovation. And we need a regulatory framework that leaves room for this, leaves room for the competitive market. Because I think in the end, you really have to ask yourself, do you trust the market or not? How has the market performed today or not? Let's look at the facts. Do you really think the government is going to do a better job? Just think the American Civil Engineering Society looks at American infrastructure. Things like roads, waters, bridges, dams, sanitary systems. The grade it gives is a D+. It sees a need for trillions of dollars of additional capital to be spent by 2020. Senator Conroy is not here. In Australia, they're behind schedule, overpriced, and the current government's reviewing the plan. These are difficult networks to build. They take enormous private investment. We've done a good job to date. I think the White House report confirms that. Now is not the time, based on fears or ideology, to change plans. Let's move forward, deal with problems that are real or that arise, but not shift over when we have a proven model of success. So thank you.
Okay, our last speaker on this panel, Eric Berlin from Chalmers University, and also the chair of the Telecommunications Society. And I think Eric might actually be mentioning some of the points that Lynn touched on in some respect.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Sure. Absolutely,
Sorry.
there will be.
Oh, if you could just please place that on for me. Thank you so much. Just so everybody can.
Like this?
Yeah, perfect.
Fine. Okay. Well, the grass is sometimes greener on the other side, it seems like. So I will be reflecting some from sort of a late awakening or late realization, perhaps in the EU, that the regulatory models and the policy frameworks is not going so well for the wireless markets in the EU. And generally for telecoms. Perhaps you've seen that there's been major initiatives over this last year on single European digital market, and in that process various new initiatives are underway and still being formulated. There's been some self-reflection on the EU being in a sort of self-image, being that well, the GSM was started here, and being a lot of leading in wireless, Ericsson, Nokia, Siemens, Alcatel, they were become very big firms, and then suddenly what's happened now in the last 5 years or so in the smartphone area, did the EU sort of lose out? And so what's happening? And eyes turning then toward the US and saying, well, the US markets are going very well. Is there something we can learn there? And today also we hear other presentations that say, okay, Korea might be better, Sweden might be better, so and so on. So this is good for cross discussion, and maybe Australia is better in some way. So I will give just a few summary points here to illustrate the dilemma here if we compare the EU and US. Here we just as a starting point, EU consumers pay less per month than US consumers for mobile wireless services, but US consumers use 5 times more voice minutes and twice as much data. Growth in investment in the US is translating into fast data connection speeds. US speeds are now 75% faster than the EU average, and the gap is expected to grow. The US is deploying LTE at much faster pace than the EU. 19% of US connection will be on LTE networks compared to less than 2% in the EU. So obviously this is problematic if you look in terms of regional competition and growth and so on. So I'll just give some of these figures, and I know we're late in time, so I think we've had the message before. Here's just an illustration, voice minutes of use per subscriber. You have United States in red there versus a lot of EU countries, and megabytes of data traffic per connection, comparing United States versus EU over this time. You see also difference. ARPU going down, maybe lower prices in the EU, but higher use in the United States. The capex, if you compare to starting point 2007, the upper one is the US and the lower one is Europe.
Unfortunately, we lost the Europe line.
Yes.
Lost the number.
Oops. Okay. Okay.
It's the projector.
Yes.
It's not zero.
Yeah. That's right. It's going like that. That's the. So here we see it LTE connections, EU and United States. And then we have a little bit on the size of markets. We have far more carriers, far more connections per carrier. So maybe that's the self-realization then in the EU, that maybe the markets are too small. A little bit surprisingly, market concentration in terms of HHI indices in Europe versus European countries versus US. You may be surprised that if we measure it in the traditional way, that the US is less concentrated than the EU. So that's so what's happening then in the EU? Is it market fragmentation, lack of coordination, spectrum policy, consolidation problems? We have many carriers in Europe, but not comprehensive pan-European carriers. And so these are questions being asked, and increasingly so. And now I'm sure the audience here and participants here can say something that the grass is actually greener on the other side of the Atlantic in some way. So let's talk about that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Probably only have time for we have no more than 5 minutes for questions, so it has to be a question, no comments. It has to be a short question that can be answered quickly.
Wait,
Hey!
Could Susan comment on that?
Yes. Thank you. So the European PAN regulator's suggestion is that in exchange for lowering mobile roaming rates across Europe and allowing a lot of consolidation and allowing network providers to do whatever they want to in terms of interconnection and treatment of packets, in exchange for mobile roaming, everything else is going to go out the window in terms of oversight of these network operators. And yes, you will see more consolidation. This will be great for ARPU for the wireless carriers in Europe. Absolutely, that's what's going to happen. Vodafone now has lots of money. They'll be able to go out there and snap up lots of companies. AT&T's talking about it too. I don't think the idea that Europe would follow the US down our path is particularly heartening in terms of market consolidation. I do think that the wireless marketplace in the United States is more competitive than the wired high-speed internet access marketplace in America. And all the facts about LTE adoption in the US being greater, that's all true. But the big direction is get mobile roaming, give up on everything else. And that, I think, is not going to be great for Europe in the long term.
One more question. Maybe two.
What's the alternative?
Actual oversight?
The question was, what was the alternative?
What's the alternative? Actual oversight for network operators. So yes, maybe you do need a larger operators over a greater area, but make sure that they're price regulated, that they're providing great services, that they do upgrades. Japan's done a pretty good job of this.
Lorenzo.
Question for Susan. I will reverse the approach comparing the wired network, the wired line. In other words, it looks to me in Europe we have maybe more competition because we are unbundling for a DSL network, but we have almost no fiber there. So we are looking at the US because we think we need a lighter touch regulation to that.
That was a comment, not a question. Good comment.
Oh no, I got this. How you doing? This question is for Len. You mentioned that 90% of people in the U.S. have access to networks over 10 megabits per second, and yet the FCC June 2012 numbers tell us that less than 20% of subscriptions in the US are actually that fast. So why the discrepancy? And there's a lot of numbers out there, and I think that the lack of consistency in our numbers is part of the problem we have.
All right. We're going to kill Jason.
I think it was actually 94% more than 10 megabits, but there is a big difference between what's available, the deployment by the carriers and actual subscription, and there's a lot of reasons around why is subscription lagging, and you have everything from some people concerned about affordability, digital literacy, some people had broadband, they dropped it. I mean, a few studies find people looked at it and said, this doesn't interest me right now. So I think there is a difference, but we have to be very careful not to confuse subscription numbers with deployment numbers as we're thinking about policy frameworks and policy, informing the policy debate.
Well, Ellie was going to do the next panel. He's not here, so we get one more question.
Well, I mean, why wouldn't we, look at adoption rates, because that's how successful that actually is, meaning it's a market issue, right? So if it's too expensive for people to afford, they won't adopt it, right?
Absolutely. I'd love to speak with the mic. No, you're absolutely right. I didn't think to suggest we should look at adoption. It's an important public policy issue. What I'm saying is when you look at adoption, you have to look at it carefully. Some people have confused them in this debate. So they say, we don't have networks reaching 94% of the people that do 10 megabits. The other piece is, a lot of people buy less than what is available to them because they find the networks are more than adequate for what they need. But I do agree with you. We have to find out who is not on broadband and why not, and define a solution for that. And if the problem is deployment, well, we define what the problem is and we find a solution for that. But let's not mix them because you're going to find a problem that doesn't exist on the deployment side.
Okay, Ellie's back. That means our panel is done. So I hand the panel.
Thank you, Henning.
Does this pen belong to anybody? It's a very nice pen. I've been using it. I should probably return it if I can. Nice little pen. I'll keep it for a while, but if you have to remember, I've got it.